The morning mist still clung to the valleys between the mountains when the old black Chevy pickup rolled down the dirt road cutting through the heart of the Gallatin Valley. The engine hummed low and steady, the way a working truck should, its bed carrying coils of fencing wire, a worn toolbox, and a rolled-up set of architectural blueprints. Behind the wheel, Elijah Brooks drove with one hand resting easy on the steering wheel, his other arm leaning out the open window, taking in the cold autumn air that swept down from the peaks of the Bridger Range. It was just past 6 in the morning, and the land was still quiet in the way only Montana could be quiet, deep, old, and entirely indifferent to whoever happened to be passing through. Elijah had been up since 4:30. He always rose early. 31 years in the United States Army will do that to a man. You wake before the alarm, your body trained by decades of reveille, of pre-dawn briefings, of field operations that began in the dark and ended long after the stars came back out. He had retired from the Army 3 years ago at the rank of colonel, and the discipline hadn't left him any more than his broad shoulders or the deliberate calmness in his eyes had. At 59, Elijah Brooks moved through the world like a man who had already seen most of what it had to offer, the best of it and the worst of it, and had chosen, very deliberately, to build something lasting with whatever time he had left. He pulled off the dirt road onto a gravel lane marked by a rusted iron gate, the kind that had been there for 60 years at least. Beyond it stretched the Harlan Ranch, 4,200 acres of historic Montana land that included open pastures, dense stands of pine and fir, a winding creek that fed into the Madison River watershed, a collection of old barns in various states of disrepair, 2 bunkhouses, a main house built in 1908 that still had most of its original timber framing, and views of the mountains that no architect or interior designer in the world could replicate or improve upon. Elijah had purchased this property 8 months ago through the Cornerstone Rural Preservation Fund, a private conservation and development organization he had founded and funded, with a significant portion of the capital he had built over 2 decades of smart investment in the agricultural sector. The deal had closed quietly, the way he preferred things to close. No press release, no announcement, no ceremony, just paperwork, wire transfers, and the quiet satisfaction of a plan finally becoming real. He stepped out of the truck and stood for a moment at the edge of the main pasture, his breath fogging slightly in the cold air. The grass was golden and frost-tipped. Above the western ridge, the sky had turned from dark blue to a pale, luminous orange that softened as it climbed toward the stars, still faintly visible in the east. A pair of mule deer stood motionless at the tree line 200 yards away, watching him without moving. He watched them back. Then they turned and disappeared into the pines, and Elijah walked toward the largest of the barns, where a set of work lights were already on. Jack Miller heard the footsteps on gravel before he saw the man coming. He stepped out from inside the barn doorway, a thermos in one hand and a tablet in the other, and when he saw Elijah, he broke into the kind of grin that comes naturally to people who are genuinely glad to see someone. Jack was 34, compact and capable, with the bearing of a man who had spent 8 years in the United States Navy before finding that the only thing he missed more than the structure of military life was working outdoors with his hands. He had served with distinction, done 2 deployments in the Pacific, and come home to Montana without a clear plan, and with a lot of unspoken weight on his shoulders. Elijah had found him through a veteran reintegration network, brought him on as foreman of this property 6 months ago, and in that time Jack had organized the labor teams, drafted the phased renovation schedule, and overseen the first round of structural assessments on every building on the property. He was exactly the kind of man Elijah built programs to find. "Morning, Colonel," Jack said. "Morning, Jack. How's the east barn looking?" "Better than we thought. The foundation's solid, the roof needs full replacement on the north end, but the timber frame is intact. We can preserve most of the original structure. Crew chief says we're 2 weeks ahead of the Phase 1 timeline." Elijah took the thermos Jack offered, drank, and handed it back. "Good. What about the bunkhouses?" "The larger one is move-in ready once we get the HVAC system updated. The smaller one needs new plumbing, probably a 3-week job. Contractor out of Bozeman is coming Thursday to give us a bid. Elijah nodded slowly, scanning the property with eyes that were already planning months ahead. He pulled the rolled blueprints from under his arm and spread them across the hood of the truck, weighing the corners down with a rock and the thermos. The plans showed a detailed layout of the Harlan Ranch, converted into a fully operational training and rehabilitation center. The kind of facility that did not exist yet in the state of Montana, but desperately needed to. The Cornerstone Veteran Agricultural Program, which he had been developing on paper for nearly 4 years, would bring former service members from across the country to this land and teach them the practical, professional skills needed to build sustainable careers in agriculture, livestock management, conservation land stewardship, and rural business operations. The program would be residential, fully funded for participants, and structured with the same rigor and clarity as a military training pipeline. He had already secured commitments from 3 federal agencies and a partnership agreement with 2 land-grant universities. The first cohort of participants was scheduled to arrive in the spring. "I want to walk the north pasture before the crew gets here," Elijah said, folding the blueprints. "I want to check the fencing situation along the creek. Amanda is driving up from Bozeman this morning with the title transfer documents from the county recorder's office. She should be here around 9. You want me to walk with you?" "No. Get the crew briefed on today's priorities. I'll be back in 40 minutes. He started walking north across the open pasture, his boots crunching on the frost-stiffened grass, the mountains rising golden and massive ahead of him. The cold was sharp and clean, the kind of cold that makes you feel entirely present in your body. He moved steadily, checking the existing fence posts as he went, noting where the wire had sagged or snapped, where the wooden posts had begun to rot at the base. He had a notepad in his chest pocket, and he stopped every few minutes to write something down. This was how he had always worked, methodically, deliberately, with full attention to the details that others overlooked. In the Army, that quality had made him an exceptional planner and a trusted commander. Out here, it was making him a rancher. He was standing at the edge of the creek, looking at a section of washed-out bank where winter flooding had undercut the fence line, when he heard a vehicle on the road behind him. He turned. It was not Amanda's car. It was a county sheriff's cruiser, moving fast down the main drive, kicking up dust. Behind it, a second cruiser followed. Elijah straightened and waited, his notepad still in his hand, his expression unhurried. He had no reason to feel alarmed. This was his land. He did not yet know what the next hour would cost him in dignity, and what it would eventually cost Thomas Walker in pride. Sheriff Thomas Walker had been the elected law enforcement officer of Gallatin County for 11 years. He was a big man, broad across the chest and thick through the arms, with close-cropped gray hair and a face that had been weathered by Montana winters into something permanently stern. He had grown up 30 miles north of Bozeman, the son of a cattle rancher, and he knew this county the way most people know their own living rooms, by feel, by instinct, by a mental map built over decades of driving the same roads in the same truck. He had a reputation for being firm, for not backing down, for running a tight department. He also had a reputation, among those who worked closely with him, for moving fast, sometimes too fast, for treating instinct like evidence when they were not always the same thing. The call had come in at 6:47 in the morning. It was from Roy Garland, a third-generation cattle rancher, who owned the adjacent property to the south of the Harlan Ranch, a man Thomas had known his entire life. Roy's voice on the radio was not panicked, but it was certain. He said there was an unfamiliar man walking the property at the old Harlan place. A black man, he said, which Thomas registered and which he told himself made no difference but which lodged itself somewhere in the back of his thinking, the way certain details do when a person is moving faster than they should be. Roy said the man was driving an old pickup with Texas plates, no visible markings, and he was walking the fence line with a notepad, which Roy interpreted as someone casing the property. Thomas had dispatched himself and Deputy Crane to the scene. He had not called Amanda Lewis, whose name and number were on file with the county, as the registered agent for the property's new ownership. He had not checked the recent county recorder's entries to see if the property had changed hands. He told himself there was no time, that the situation on the ground required a rapid response, that he could sort out the paperwork details once he had the scene secured. He was wrong on every count, but he did not know that yet, and the certainty with which he operated made his wrongness invisible to him as he turned off the main road and into the Harlan property. He spotted Elijah standing at the creek bank from about 100 yards away and brought the cruiser to a stop. Deputy Crane pulled in beside him. Thomas got out, adjusted his hat, and walked toward the man with the deliberate, measured stride of someone who expected their authority to precede them like a wave. He was not unfriendly in his manner, but he was not open either. He was already positioned. "Morning," he said when he was close enough. "Thomas Walker, Gallatin County Sheriff. Mind if I ask what you're doing on this property?" Elijah looked at him evenly. "Good morning, Sheriff. I'm the owner. I'm walking my fence line to assess some flood damage along the creek bank." He held up the notepad. "I've got documentation on me. My name is Elijah Brooks." "Mr. Brooks?" Thomas's tone did not shift. "We had a call from a neighbor reporting someone unfamiliar on this property. I need to verify your presence here. Do you have anything on you that establishes your right to access?" "I have a scanned copy of the deed of purchase on my phone," Elijah said, already reaching for it calmly, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. "I also have the contact information for my attorney, Amanda Lewis. She handles all legal documentation for the property, and she is on her way here this morning with the physical copies from the county recorder." Thomas looked at the phone screen Elijah extended toward him. It showed a multi-page PDF document, a property deed. There were names on it, legal descriptions, county stamps. A person inclined to examine it carefully would have taken note of the name Elijah Brooks in the purchaser field, and the property address matching the land they were standing on. Thomas glanced at it. He did not examine it carefully. The scanned document looked, to his moving eyes, like something that could have been pulled from any number of sources. He had seen fake paperwork before. He told himself he would need the originals. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step back to your vehicle while I verify this information," he said. "I'm happy to cooperate," Elijah said, walking with him toward the truck, still completely composed. Around them, 3 of the work crew who had been moving toward the barn stopped what they were doing and watched. Jack Miller had seen the cruisers arrive and had come out of the barn quickly, wiping his hands on a rag. He approached at a jog, his expression already tightening. "Sheriff, I can vouch for this man. I'm Jack Miller, I'm the foreman here. Elijah Brooks is the owner of this ranch. We've been working here for 6 months." Thomas looked at Jack. "And you have documentation of your employment here?" Jack showed his phone, a signed employment contract, a work authorization letter on cornerstone letterhead. Thomas looked at it the same way he had looked at the deed. He was not reading. He was looking for reasons to continue rather than reasons to stop. Deputy Crane, younger and visibly more uncertain than his boss, had walked to the edge of the scene and was saying nothing. He would say later, privately, that he knew something was wrong, but that he did not speak up. That silence would stay with him. "Here's the problem," Thomas said, and his voice had taken on the tone of a man who has already made a decision and is now explaining it. "I have a complaint from a neighbor. I have an individual on the property without verified documentation, and I have an inconsistency in the account you've given me. I'm not able to clear this on a phone screen until I can verify with the county recorder's office. I need to treat this as a trespassing situation." "The county recorder's office opens at 8, Elijah said quietly. "It is now approximately 7:15. My attorney will be here before 8 with original documents. I am asking you respectfully to wait 45 minutes before taking any further action." "I understand your request," Thomas said, "but I'm not able to leave the situation unresolved." "What situation?" Jack said, his voice rising slightly despite himself. "The man showed you his deed. He showed you his attorney's contact information. I showed you my contract. What exactly is unresolved?" "Jack." Elijah's voice was quiet, but it landed with authority. Jack stopped. Elijah turned back to the sheriff. "Do what you feel you need to do, Sheriff. Thomas Walker looked at Elijah Brooks for a long moment. What he should have seen was a composed, credentialed, clearly legitimate man standing on his own property on a cold autumn morning. What he saw instead was a variable he had not accounted for, an inconsistency in his mental map of this county, a face he did not recognize on land he thought he knew. He reached for the cuffs on his belt. Elijah Brooks, I am placing you under arrest for trespassing. You have the right to remain silent. The workers stood in stunned silence. Jack's jaw tightened. The mule deer were long gone. The mountains watched, indifferent and immovable, as the handcuffs closed around the wrists of the man who owned every acre of land within a mile in every direction. The handcuffs were cold. Elijah noticed that detail the way you notice small, specific things when your mind is working to stay level and not let the heat of injustice push you somewhere counterproductive. 31 years in the Army teaches a person to manage internal temperature, to separate the emotion from the response, to stay operational under pressure. He breathed slowly and said nothing as Deputy Crane guided him to the rear seat of the cruiser. The door closed. The seat was hard plastic, and through the window he could see Jack Miller standing with both hands on top of his head, looking at the car with an expression that mixed anger and helplessness in equal measure. Elijah did not feel anger yet. That would come later, processed privately, filed away. What he felt in that moment was something closer to clarity, the sharp, somewhat cold recognition that what was happening was exactly the kind of thing his program was built to help people survive. He had built an organization around the belief that discipline, preparation, and community could carry a person through circumstances they did not deserve. He had believed that abstractly, theoretically. Now he was inside one of those circumstances. The irony was not lost on him, and despite everything, some part of him recognized it with something that was not quite a smile. Outside the cruiser, Thomas Walker stood with Deputy Crane at a distance, speaking in low tones. The work crew had gathered in a loose cluster near the barn, not moving, not working, watching with the particular wariness of people who have seen this kind of scene before and know better than to escalate it. Two of the crew members were veterans themselves. One had served in Iraq, the other in Afghanistan. They stood with their arms folded and their faces carefully neutral, containing things that did not need to be contained in this moment, because Elijah had told them with one look that this was not the moment to make it worse. Jack had pulled out his phone and was calling Amanda Lewis. She picked up on the second ring. Amanda, we have a serious problem. The sheriff just arrested Elijah for trespassing on the ranch. There was a pause. Then her voice came back, clipped and precise. I'm already in the car. I'm 40 minutes out. Keep everyone calm. Do not let anyone say or do anything that gives the sheriff additional grounds for anything. I'm calling the county recorder's office right now. He showed Walker the scanned deed on his phone. He gave him your contact information. Walker didn't verify. Another pause, shorter this time. 40 minutes, Jack. He hung up and walked to the cruiser. He knocked on the window. Thomas walked over and positioned himself between Jack and the car, which was not necessary but was the kind of instinctive territorial move that reveals more about a person's state of mind than they intend. Sheriff, I need you to understand the full scope of what you've done, Jack said, keeping his voice even. The man in that car is a retired United States Army colonel who served this country for 31 years. He is the documented legal owner of this property. His attorney is 40 minutes away with original copies of every document you need. You have arrested a man on his own land for being on his own land. I understand you feel strongly about this, Thomas said. The situation will be clarified when documentation is verified. You had documentation. He showed you documentation. He told you his attorney was on the way. Digital copies aren't verification. Jack looked at him steadily. He asked you to wait 45 minutes. His attorney is 40 minutes away. You couldn't wait. Thomas said nothing. Jack turned and walked back to the crew. He did not trust himself to say anything further, and he knew Elijah would not want him to. Inside the cruiser, Elijah was thinking about a conversation he had once had with a general he admired, a man named Harold Perkins who had commanded a division in the First Gulf War, and later gone on to advise 3 administrations on military affairs. Harold had told him, over coffee in the Pentagon cafeteria in 2003, that the greatest test of a leader's character was not how they behaved when they had power, but how they behaved when power was being used against them unjustly. He had said that the world was always watching the man who keeps his dignity, when dignity is the one thing being taken from him, and that those who keep it earn a form of authority that no rank or title can manufacture. Elijah sat with his hands cuffed behind him and thought about that. He thought about the crew outside. He thought about what they were absorbing right now, what they would carry from this morning for the rest of their lives. He thought about the veterans who would arrive at this ranch in the spring, men and women who had been through things far worse than this, who had come home from war carrying invisible weight, who needed to see someone demonstrate that it was possible to face injustice without letting injustice reshape your identity. He understood, with the calm that comes from long discipline, that even this moment had a purpose. He just had to hold his shape long enough for the moment to complete itself. He glanced at his watch. 7:22. Amanda would be here before 8:30. He leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes. And in the cold back seat of a Gallatin County Sheriff's cruiser, the owner of 4,200 acres of Montana ranch land waited with the patience of a man who already knew how this story would end. Across the pasture, the frost was beginning to melt off the grass as the sun climbed. 2 ravens appeared on the ridge of the east barn and looked down at the scene with what seemed, if you were inclined to read the natural world, like a combination of curiosity and contempt. Thomas Walker sat in his cruiser filling out a trespassing report. He was moving quickly, efficiently, the way he always worked, which was the problem that no one around him had yet found a way to fix. Speed felt like competence from the inside. From the outside that morning, it looked like something else entirely. Amanda Lewis had driven this highway enough times to know exactly which curves to take easy and which straightaways to push. She drove with her phone on the mount, one call already completed with the county recorder's office, and another in progress with her paralegal back in Bozeman, who was scanning and resending every document in the Harlan Ranch file to her phone and tablet in real time. She had been Elijah's attorney for 6 years, and in that time she had handled 14 property acquisitions, 3 business formations, and more due diligence reviews than she cared to count. She was organized in the way that only certain people managed to be, not just methodically, but architecturally, with every piece of information in a designated place, and every contingency thought through in advance. This situation was not one she had anticipated, but she had prepared for it anyway, the way she prepared for everything, with documentation so thorough that reality had no reasonable alternative but to align with it. She had the original certified deed in a legal file folder on the passenger seat. She had the county recorder's stamped transfer certificate. She had the abstract of title showing the full chain of ownership from 1908 to the present. She had the closing disclosure, the wire transfer confirmation, the conservation easement filing, and 6 months of property tax payment receipts. She had a signed letter from the county assessor confirming that Elijah Marcus Brooks was the registered property owner of record. She had printed copies of his identification. She had, in short, enough documentation to prove the point beyond any standard of evidence imaginable in a civil or criminal proceeding, and she intended to present all of it in the gravel driveway of the Harlan Ranch within the next 30 minutes. Riding with her in the passenger seat was David Nguyen from the Gallatin County Recorder's Office. David was 41, cautious by professional temperament, and extremely uncomfortable about what he had agreed to do, which was drive out to a property dispute with an attorney on his personal time. But Amanda had called him directly at 7:32, explained the situation in 4 sentences, and asked him to come. And David, who had processed the Harlan Ranch title transfer himself, and who had a very clear memory of Elijah Brooks' name on that deed, had looked at his coffee, looked at his keys, and decided that some situations required the human being to show up rather than the bureaucratic process. He had brought his official recorder's seal. "How did this happen?" he said, for the second time since they had left Bozeman. A neighbor called in a trespassing report, Amanda said, eyes on the road. The sheriff responded without verifying the county's ownership records. We have those records publicly accessible online. I know. He could have checked them on his phone in 30 seconds. I know, David. Why didn't he? I don't know why, David. Her voice was not unkind. It was focused. We'll get there and sort it out. They drove in silence for a few minutes. The mountains came into view on their left, massive and serene, utterly unconcerned with the drama unfolding at their base. Montana had a way of making human affairs feel simultaneously urgent and very small. I need you to understand something, Amanda said after a while. The man they arrested is a retired Army colonel. He served 31 years. He built a foundation from the ground up to help veterans reintegrate into civilian life. He purchased this land legally, documented every step of it, and came out here this morning to do honest work on a property he owns. He did everything right. Everything. And he is sitting in the back of a sheriff's cruiser right now, because someone made a call, based on incomplete information, and moved too fast to correct it. David looked out the window. I understand. I'm not telling you for sympathy. I'm telling you because I need you to walk onto that property with me and state clearly and officially, as a representative of the county recorder's office, that Elijah Brooks is the owner of that land. Your presence and your seal are going to matter more than anything else I can show them. I understand, he said again, and this time, it meant something different. They turned off the highway onto the county road. From here, Amanda could already see, in the distance, the cluster of vehicles near the barn. The sheriff's cruisers, the old Chevy pickup, the work trucks. She pressed the accelerator slightly. 8 minutes later, she pulled through the iron gate and up the gravel drive, parking behind the sheriff's cruisers with a deliberateness that communicated everything about where things stood. She got out before the dust had settled. David followed with his official briefcase. Jack Miller was at her side within seconds. He's in the back of the cruiser, Jack said quietly. Walker wrote him up for trespassing. He hasn't been transported yet. Good. Amanda walked directly toward the cruiser, and then, before she reached it, she turned and walked toward Thomas Walker, who had seen her arrive and was already stepping out of his vehicle with an expression that was working very hard to remain neutral. Sheriff Walker, she said. Amanda Lewis. I'm the attorney of record for Elijah Brooks and the legal representative for Cornerstone Rural Preservation Fund, the entity that holds title to this property. I have here a certified copy of the deed, the county recorder's transfer certificate, and several supporting documents. She held up the folder. Then she gestured to the man beside her. This is David Nguyen from the Gallatin County Recorder's office. He processed this transaction personally. Thomas looked at both of them. Something in his face shifted, barely perceptibly. The first small adjustment of a man beginning to realize he is looking at a problem he cannot manage the way he manages most problems. I'll need to review those documents, he said. Of course, Amanda said. I'd also appreciate it if Mr. Brooks were allowed to step out of the vehicle while you do. Thomas Walker held the folder of documents with both hands and read through them the way he should have examined that phone screen 2 hours earlier. Slowly, carefully, with the full weight of his attention. The certified deed was unambiguous. The name Elijah Marcus Brooks appeared in the purchaser's field. The property description matched the land they were standing on. Every section and boundary notation corresponding exactly to the survey plat attached to the rear of the packet. The county recorder's transfer certificate bore David Nguyen's official seal and signature. The tax payment receipts were chronological, clean, and complete. The closing disclosure showed the purchase price and the wire transfer reference number. The abstract of title traced the property's ownership from 1908 forward, and its final entry showed the transfer from the estate of Harold Harlan, Jr. to the Cornerstone Rural Preservation Fund on behalf of Elijah Marcus Brooks, dated 8 months prior. There was no ambiguity in any of it. There was nothing that required interpretation. The land belonged to Elijah Brooks. It had belonged to him for 8 months. The man Thomas had placed in handcuffs in the back of his cruiser was not a trespasser. He was the most documented property owner in Gallatin County that morning. Thomas lowered the folder. He looked at David Nguyen, who met his gaze without flinching. You processed this transaction yourself? I did, David said. I remember it clearly. Mr. Brooks came in personally to finalize the recording. He brought everything in order. It was one of the cleaner title transfers we've seen in that office in years. Thomas looked at Deputy Crane, who was standing a few feet away with the expression of a man who would very much like to be somewhere else. Then he looked at the cruiser where Elijah sat. Then he looked back at Amanda. Release him, he said to Crane. Crane moved to the cruiser without delay. He opened the rear door and spoke quietly to Elijah, then helped him out and removed the handcuffs. Elijah stepped out, straightened his jacket, rotated his wrists once, and stood in the pale autumn sunlight with the stillness of a man who had already made peace with the last 2 hours, and was now simply present for what came next. Thomas Walker walked toward him. The gravel crunched under his boots. The work crew had gathered near the barn. Jack Miller stood with his arms folded. Amanda stood a few feet to Elijah's left. The file folder closed now, her role for the moment complete. David Nguyen stood off to the side, his briefcase at his feet, watching. Thomas stopped a few feet in front of Elijah and looked at him. This was, in Thomas's 11 years as sheriff, one of the longest moments of his professional life. Not because of the silence, but because of what the silence contained. He was a man who had built an entire professional identity around being the person in the room who was right. Not reckless, not cruel, but confident in his own judgment to a degree that had, on this particular morning, caused him to override the evidence that was directly in front of him and substitute his own certainty for it. That certainty had put a decorated Army colonel in handcuffs on his own land. There was no version of that fact that Thomas could arrange into something comfortable. Mr. Brooks, he said. His voice was even, but it cost him something. The documentation is clear. You are the legal owner of this property. I was wrong to proceed the way I did this morning. I should have taken more time to verify the information you provided before taking action. I did not do that, and the result was that you were treated in a way that was not warranted. I apologize to you directly and sincerely. Elijah looked at him. There was no triumph in his expression, and no performance of forgiveness that was designed to make the other man feel better. There was something more honest than either of those things. A calm, steady attention. The face of a man who was taking the measure of the moment without rushing past it. I appreciate that, Sheriff, he said. His voice was unhurried. I want to say something, if I may. Please. Elijah looked around briefly. At the crew, at Jack, at Amanda, at David Nguyen, at Deputy Crane, and then back at Thomas. Authority is a serious thing. I've carried it for most of my adult life. And the lesson I had to learn early, and relearn many times, is that authority without verification is not authority. It's assumption dressed up in a uniform. The most dangerous decisions I ever had to make in the Army were the ones where I was most certain I was right and least inclined to check the facts first. Every time I let that certainty override my process, people paid for it. Sometimes the wrong people. He paused. What happened this morning was wrong. And I think we both know that the reason it happened, the real reason, underneath the paperwork, is something that this community is going to have to sit with and be honest about. But I'm not interested in making this morning into a weapon. I'm interested in building something on this land that makes the next 2 hours matter for something. The silence after he finished was the kind of silence that has weight and texture. Nobody moved. The mountains stood in the distance, enormous and unblinking. The work crew was very still. Thomas nodded slowly. What you said is right, he said. Every word of it. The trespassing charge was voided before noon. Amanda had the paperwork in hand by 11, the record corrected and clean. David Nguyen drove back to Bozeman with his seal and his conscience intact, and he told the story to 3 colleagues at the office, quietly, without drama, because it was the kind of story that needed to circulate so that the error could be properly understood, and so that the people responsible for maintaining public records understood, in concrete and personal terms, what those records meant when real situations pressed against them. Amanda stayed at the ranch for another hour after the documentation was confirmed. She sat with Elijah at the folding table Jack had set up outside the main barn, drank coffee from a thermos, and went through the remaining paperwork she had brought, some of it unrelated to the morning's events, administrative details about the conservation easement, and the federal partnership agreement that needed signatures. She did not ask Elijah how he was feeling, because she had known him long enough to understand that he processed internally, that he was already somewhere past the acute phase of the morning and working through the longer meaning of it. She could see it in the way he read the documents she put in front of him. Careful, complete, thorough. The same way he read everything, as though the morning had not interrupted his operational tempo at all. When they finished, she gathered the files and stood to leave. Then she paused. "I want to say something off the record." "Go ahead." "What you did in that moment, when Walker came to apologize. I've seen a lot of situations like this. Not exactly like this, but the category of situation. And I have watched people respond to that moment in a lot of different ways. Some of them understandable and some of them counterproductive and some of them very costly in terms of what came next. What you did was the hardest version of the right thing." She looked at him steadily. "I just wanted to say that out loud." Elijah held her gaze for a moment. "The harder version of the right thing is usually the only one worth doing," he said. "Everything else is just the easier version of the wrong thing wearing a better costume." She nodded once and got in her car. He watched her drive out through the iron gate and then turned back to the ranch. Thomas Walker did not go back to the department immediately after leaving the ranch. He drove out to the Gallatin River instead, parked on the shoulder of the road near a pullout he had used 100 times over the years, and sat in his cruiser for 35 minutes looking at the water. He was not a man given to self-examination, or at least he had not been. He had always moved in the direction of action, believing that motion was a proxy for competence. Sitting still felt like weakness to him, but he sat still, and he thought about what Elijah had said, and he tried to trace the chain of his own decision-making that morning back to its origin point. He found it quickly, and the finding was uncomfortable. When Roy Garland had called and said there was a black man in unfamiliar clothes walking the Harlan Ranch with a notepad, Thomas had registered that description and had not interrogated his own reaction to it the way a professional committed to objectivity was required to do. He had moved fast, and the speed had been, in part, a way of not slowing down enough to ask himself why he was certain, on the basis of a neighbor's phone call, that the man on the property did not belong there. He had looked at the deed on the phone and found reasons to doubt it rather than reasons to trust it. He had looked at Jack's employment contract and done the same. He had been inclined, from the moment Roy described what he was seeing, toward a particular conclusion, and the documentation that should have corrected that conclusion had not been given the attention it needed because he had already decided. That was not who he wanted to be as a law enforcement officer. It was not, he realized, who he had believed himself to be. The gap between those two things, the professional he believed himself to be and the professional he had been that morning, was the thing that made the 35 minutes by the river necessary. He thought about the men he had admired over the years, older sheriffs and senior officers who had given him advice when he was starting out. One of them, a retired sheriff named Gerald Pratt, who had served 4 terms in Cascade County, and who Thomas had interned under in his early 20s, had told him something that Thomas had filed away and mostly forgotten until this moment. Gerald had said, "The badge is not the judgment. The badge is the obligation to find the judgment. If you confuse those two things, you will do harm to people who don't deserve it. And the worst part is, you'll feel justified while you're doing it." Thomas had thought he understood that. He had not understood it as well as he believed. He picked up his phone and called Roy Garland. The phone rang 3 times and Roy picked up. "Roy," Thomas said, "it's Walker. I need to talk to you about the call you made this morning." There was a brief silence. "I reported what I saw," Roy said. His voice was neither defensive nor apologetic. It was the voice of a man who believed he had done the right thing, and was not entirely sure why he was getting a phone call suggesting otherwise. "You reported that there was a black man you didn't recognize on the Harlan property?" Thomas said. "I need to ask you something directly. If you had seen a white man you didn't recognize doing the same thing, walking the fence line, looking at the property, would you have called it in?" A longer silence this time. "I reported a suspicious situation," Roy said. I know what you reported, Thomas said. I'm asking about the thing underneath the report, about what made it suspicious to you, specifically. He paused. Think about it. I'm not asking you to answer me right now, but I want you to think about it honestly, because the man you reported this morning owns that property. He bought it 8 months ago, legally, completely. Every document in order. He has been working on that land for half a year. And because you called, and because I moved too fast, he spent 2 hours in the back of my cruiser in handcuffs on land that belongs to him. He paused. I want you to sit with that, Roy. And I want to come talk to you about it sometime this week. Neighbor to neighbor. Another silence. Then, quietly, I didn't know. I know you didn't. That's part of it too. He hung up and sat a few more minutes by the river. Then he drove back to the department. When he arrived, he called a meeting. His full team, 6 deputies and an administrative sergeant, sat around the conference table, and Thomas stood at the front and told them exactly what had happened that morning. All of it. Not a version of it that softened his role or redistributed the responsibility. The version where he had made a decision based on a neighbor's call and an incomplete look at the evidence, and where that decision had resulted in the wrongful arrest of a property owner on his own land. The room was very quiet when he finished. It was the quiet of people who were processing something that challenged a comfortable assumption. The assumption that their department's confidence was always earned, and their decisions always sound. Several of the deputies had worked with Thomas for years. They respected him. The story he had just told them did not destroy that respect, but it recalibrated it in a way that was ultimately healthier for everyone in the room. I'm telling you this, Thomas said, because the standard we hold ourselves to is only as real as what we do when we fall below it. I fell below it this morning, and starting today, we are going to change how we handle property complaint calls. Before any action is taken on a property dispute involving a presence on private land, the deputy on scene is required to run a county recorder's check on the property in question. It takes 30 seconds on the database, and it tells you immediately who the registered owner is. We are also going to establish a verification protocol for any documentation presented at the scene of a property complaint, including digital documentation. A phone screen showing a deed is not nothing. It is the beginning of a verification process, and it is required to be followed through. He looked around the room. Any questions? Deputy Crane raised his hand. Is there anything we can do to address what happened directly? Yes, Thomas said. We're going to reach out to Mr. Brooks. We're going to ask if there's any way we can be of constructive service to his project on that ranch. And I am going to call Roy Garland and have a direct conversation with him about what it means to contact law enforcement about a neighbor on the basis of observation alone. He paused. And I'm going to contact Elijah Brooks personally and ask if he would be willing to speak to this department. Not because I think a speech fixes anything, but because I think we need to see what we almost prevented. The meeting ended. The deputies filed out. Thomas sat alone in the conference room and looked at the seal on the wall. The county seal, the one that appeared on every official document his department produced, on every badge worn by every person who worked for him. He looked at it for a while and thought about what it was supposed to stand for, and the distance between the symbol and the practice, and how that distance was precisely what leadership existed to close. He had 11 years left before retirement, if he chose to stay. He intended to use them better than he had used that morning. Not as penance. He was not a man who believed in penance as a productive use of time, but as application. As the daily, incremental work of becoming the professional the badge required him to be. He turned off the conference room light and drove home through a county that looked the same as it always had, and felt, to him, slightly different than it ever had before. Elijah did not take a day off after the arrest. He was back at the ranch the following morning at 6:15, same truck, same boots, same notepad. The crew was already there when he arrived, and when they saw his headlights coming down the gravel drive through the early morning dark, several of them stopped what they were doing and stood a little straighter, not at attention, the way soldiers stand, but with the particular alertness of people who had seen something difficult the day before and were relieved, in a way that went deeper than they might have been able to articulate, to see that it had not driven the man away from what he was, building. He gathered them before work began, standing in the open pasture in the early light, the frost on the grass, and the mountains pink in the east, and the breath of 12 men and women visible in the cold air. He did not call them to attention. He simply walked out to the middle of the pasture and stood there, and they came to him the way people come to someone they trust, naturally, without hierarchy, making it awkward. "I want to say something about yesterday," he said, "and then I want us to move forward and not look back at it unless we're choosing to learn from it." He let that phrase land. What happened to me yesterday is not unusual. Many of you know that. Some of you have experienced things like it yourselves, in different forms and in different places. I'm not going to tell you it was acceptable, because it was not. But I'm going to tell you that how we respond to things that are not acceptable is where character lives. Not in the things that happen to us, in what we do after. He looked at each of them in turn, making eye contact with every person in the semicircle. I did not respond with anger or humiliation or retaliation. I responded with documentation, with patience, and with a clear statement of what I believe about authority and responsibility. And the reason I want you to know that, the reason I'm standing here telling you this instead of just moving on, is that this place is going to be full of people who've been through things that were not acceptable. Veterans who've faced real adversity, who've come home from service into a world that didn't make a lot of room for them, who have every right to be angry and aren't always sure what to do with that anger. And when they come here, I want them to find a model, not a perfect person, not someone who never gets knocked down, but someone who shows them what it looks like to get knocked down and get up with your integrity intact. He paused. The air was very still. A hawk circled somewhere high above the east pasture, riding the first thermal of the morning. "This ranch is the model," he said. "Not just the program, not just the curriculum, the way we work here, the way we talk to each other here, the way we handle difficulty here. All of it is the model. Yesterday was a chapter in that, and I didn't plan it, but I intend to use it." He looked at Jack. "Now let's get to work." Jack nodded. The crew dispersed to their assignments with the focused energy of people who have been given something clarifying rather than something burdensome. Elijah walked to the east barn and spent the morning working alongside the renovation team, carrying lumber, checking measurements, applying himself to the physical work the way he always had, completely, without distraction. There was something grounding about it. The grain of the wood and the smell of sawdust, and the satisfaction of a board set square in a nail-driven flush. He had discovered the particular quality of physical labor later in life than most men do. But the discovery had been important. It had taught him something that the Army, for all its virtues, had not quite managed to teach him. That presence in the body, the specific attention required to do a simple physical task correctly, was one of the most reliable paths back to equilibrium when the mind had been through something hard. By midday, the east barn's north wall had 3 new support beams installed, plumb and solid, and the crew chief was saying they'd finish the section before Thursday. Elijah ate lunch on a stack of lumber with Jack and 2 of the carpenters, listening more than he talked, learning the names of the workers' families, their histories, what had brought them to this part of Montana. Small details accumulated. He was good at that, at being the kind of person other people felt comfortable being specific with, because he was actually interested in the specifics. Amanda called at noon. "The department has reached out. Thomas Walker wants to speak with you." "I expected he would. How do you want to handle it?" "I'll meet him here, at the ranch. On your terms. On honest terms, which are everyone's terms if they're willing to accept them." In the days between the arrest and Thomas's visit, Elijah did something that nobody on the crew knew about except Jack, who figured it out from the late-night phone calls he sometimes heard through the bunkhouse wall. Elijah reached out quietly to 3 people he trusted deeply: a retired federal judge he had known for 20 years, a community relations specialist who had worked with law enforcement agencies across the Mountain West, and a professor of rural sociology at Montana State, who had been studying the intersection of land ownership, race, and rural community dynamics for 15 years. He did not ask them for advice about his specific situation. He asked them what they had learned over their careers, about the most productive ways to convert a moment of institutional failure into a moment of institutional learning. He listened carefully to what each of them said, took notes, and synthesized what they told him into a framework he carried with him when Thomas Walker's truck came through the gate 4 days later. Thomas came alone, as Elijah had specified, without his cruiser, in a personal truck that had seen its share of ranch roads, and was none the worse for it. He met Elijah at the barn, and they shook hands, and there was in that handshake a slight formality that acknowledged, without naming it, the weight of what had happened between them. Then they walked together out to the north pasture where the new fence line was already taking shape. Straight wooden posts set at 8-foot intervals, gleaming wire strung taut between them, solid and deliberate. They talked for nearly 2 hours. Thomas asked about the program, about the curriculum, about what the ranch would look like in a year. Elijah explained it in detail. The residential training cohorts organized into 4 12-week rotations per year. The agricultural education tracks covering soil science, livestock management, water conservation, and crop planning. The partnership with Montana State and the University of Wyoming for credentialing. The conservation work along the creek corridor that would be done in collaboration with the State Fish and Wildlife Office, the financial literacy and rural business operations, track that would help participants develop their own long-term plans. The mental health support component, designed by a clinical team with specialized experience in veteran care, woven into the program's structure not as a separate track, but as an integrated element present in every part of the schedule. In the evening debriefs, in the peer mentorship structure, in the one-on-one check-ins that Jack and the other senior staff conducted weekly. Thomas listened with the attentiveness of a man who was genuinely paying attention, not constructing a response. He asked follow-up questions that were specific and showed he had absorbed what he'd heard. He asked about the financial model, about how participants were selected, about what happened to the graduates of the program and how their outcomes were tracked. He asked about the conservation work and whether the county's Natural Resources Office was involved. He asked about the creek restoration project and whether it was connected to the watershed restoration initiative the state had launched 2 years prior. At one point, walking the fence line and looking out at the north pasture where the grass was still golden and the creek glinted in the afternoon light, Thomas said, "Is there anything my department can do?" "Come to the orientation when the first cohort arrives," Elijah said. "Not in uniform, as a neighbor, as a person. Let them see that the county is glad they're here, and let them see what county officials look like when they're not in an official capacity. Because a lot of the veterans coming here have had complicated experiences with institutions, law enforcement included. The more they can see that the people inside those institutions are also just people. People who can learn, people who can work alongside them, people who can show up in a field and pull weeds, the better." Thomas nodded. "I'll be there. There's something else," Elijah said. He stopped walking and looked at Thomas directly, in the way that he had looked at him that morning in the pasture when the handcuffs came off, fully, steadily, without any agenda except honesty. "I want to propose something to your department, and I'd ask you to take it to your team. I'd like to offer a series of informal visits here over the next year, for officers who want to come, not a required attendance, where they can see the work we're doing and meet the veterans in the program. Not training, not a lecture, just contact. Because most misunderstandings between communities and institutions come from distance, and the best way to close distance is to be in the same place doing useful work." He paused. "If your deputies come out here and spend a Saturday afternoon helping us repair a fence line or restore a pasture, they will know something real about this place and about the people in it. And the people in this program will know something real about them. That is worth more than any policy change or public statement." Thomas looked at him for a long moment. There was no performance in Thomas's expression, no gratitude designed to reassure, no apology performing itself again. Just the face of a man who was genuinely thinking about what he was being offered, and what it would cost him, and what it would produce. "I'll make the offer to my team," he said finally, "and I'll be the first one there." They shook hands again at Thomas's truck, And this time, the handshake was different from the first one. The weight was still there, because it did not dissolve quickly and should not have. But something else was in it too. The beginning, tentative and real, of a working relationship between two men who had found each other in the worst possible way and were choosing, with full awareness of the difficulty involved, to build something from it anyway. Thomas drove out through the iron gate. Elijah watched the truck until it was gone. Then he turned back to the ranch and walked toward the east barn, where the sound of hammering had resumed, and the smell of fresh lumber carried on the afternoon air. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do, which was not a burden, but the greatest possible reassurance. The knowledge that the thing you're building is real enough to require your continued presence. Spring came to the Gallatin Valley the way it always does, slowly at first, and then all at once. The snow retreated up the mountain slopes in stages, the tree line shifting week by week as the elevation of the freeze point climbed. The creek ran high and fast with snowmelt, brown at the edges where the banks were soft and clear in the middle channel, where the current moved with purpose. The pastures greened from the south fence line up toward the ridge, the new grass coming in bright and even where the soil had been properly aerated and reseeded over the winter. And the old Harlan Ranch, now officially registered with the state and the county as the Cornerstone, Montana Veteran Agricultural Center, came alive with the kind of purposeful energy that makes a place feel like it has finally become what it was always supposed to be. The renovation was complete. The east barn stood solid and restored, its original timber frame preserved and reinforced with new structural members, its roof rebuilt with standing seam metal that would last another century. The west barn had been converted into a fully equipped agricultural training facility with climate-controlled workspaces, tool storage, and a teaching kitchen used for the food preservation curriculum. The bunkhouses had been updated with new plumbing, HVAC, and efficient lighting systems while keeping the character of the original buildings intact. The main house, built in 1908 and still standing with the confidence of something that was made to last, had been restored to serve as the program's administrative headquarters, conference facility, and staff housing. The creek bank restoration was 40% complete. Native grasses and sedges already taking hold along the stabilized sections, the water running cleaner through the repaired channel than it had in years. The north pasture fence line was finished, every post straight, every wire properly tensioned, and the first of the livestock had been introduced to the property, 12 head of Angus cattle that the participants of the first cohort would help manage as part of the livestock curriculum. The first cohort arrived on a Tuesday in late April. 22 veterans from 11 states, ranging in age from 26 to 53, with service records spanning the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, and Coast Guard. They came from cities and small towns, from the South and the Northwest, and the Midwest, and the Mid-Atlantic. They came from different backgrounds, different branches, different eras of service. Some had deployed multiple times in the post-September 11 wars. Others had served in peacetime roles that were quieter, but no less demanding, no less defining. What they shared was this: they had served, they had come home, and the transition had been harder than anyone had told them it would be. Some had struggled with employment, their military experience valuable in ways that civilian employers could not easily quantify, and therefore often overlooked. Some had struggled with direction, with the particular disorientation that comes from spending years inside a structure that gave every day a clear purpose, and then suddenly finding themselves in a world that required them to manufacture their own structure from scratch, without the resources or the community to do it. Some had struggled with things they did not have words for yet, which is the most common and the most difficult kind of struggling. They arrived on buses and in personal vehicles, carrying duffel bags and backpacks, some of them with the relaxed efficiency of people who know how to pack for an extended operational period, and some of them with the slight uncertainty of people who were not entirely sure what they had signed up for, but had decided to show up anyway. They stood in the gravel parking area next to the main barn and looked at the mountains and the pastures and the carefully restored buildings and the new fence lines running straight across the land, and most of them were quiet in a way that is different from ordinary quiet. It was the quiet of people who are looking at something and feeling, underneath the looking, the tentative and slightly frightening possibility that this might actually be a place meant for them. Elijah greeted each of them personally. He stood at the entrance to the main barn and shook every hand, made eye contact, asked where they had served and what branch and what emos or rating, letting the answers land and holding each person's story for the moment it took to acknowledge it properly. He did not give a speech at the welcome. He had learned, over a long career commanding people, that speeches at the beginning of something set the wrong expectation. They positioned the talking as the central activity, when the central activity was always the work. The talking was the scaffolding. The work was the building. Instead, he walked them through the facility at a pace that allowed them to see things, not just pass through them. He took them into the training barn and let them handle the tools and examine the soil testing equipment, and ask questions about the livestock management protocols. He showed them the bunkhouses and the dining facility and the outdoor classroom space he had built near the creek, a simple structure of timber and corrugated roofing, where the conservation curriculum would take place in direct contact with the land being studied. He introduced them to Jack and to the other staff, the livestock specialist, the soil scientist, the conservation biologist, the financial literacy instructor, the clinical counselor who held weekly one-on-one sessions with every participant and who carried herself with the ease of someone who had done this long enough to know that ease was the most important tool she had. And then Elijah walked them out to the north pasture and handed each of them a pair of work gloves from a bin by the gate. "We're going to start with the creek restoration project," he said. "The bank has been eroding for a long time, and we're going to fix it. Grab a shovel and follow Jack." They worked for 3 hours. It was hard work, moving heavy rock, cutting invasive root systems, tamping soil and setting native plant plugs at measured intervals along the stabilized bank. It was also, for most of them, the most immediately satisfying thing they had done in recent memory. Not because it was dramatic or significant in scale, but because the result of their labor was visible at the end of every shovel stroke. You moved the rock was moved. You planted the grass plug, the grass was planted. The feedback loop was direct and immediate and real in a way that a lot of post-service life was not. And several of them felt something they recognized but hadn't felt in a while: the specific physical and mental engagement of purposeful collective work. By dinner, the large bunkhouse dining room was loud and warm, with the overlapping conversations of 22 people who were still strangers to each other, but not for much longer. The food was substantial and good, the kind of cooking that happens when you take it seriously, which the kitchen staff did, because 2 of the 3 cooks were veterans themselves, who had found their vocation in food service after leaving the military. The evening's informal structure, no formal program, just dinner and conversation, was intentional. Elijah believed that the most important community building happened in the spaces between the scheduled activities, and he had designed those spaces carefully. By the end of the first week, the cohort had established the informal social architecture that groups always establish: the natural leaders, the quiet observers, the connectors, the skeptics who would come around once they saw results. Elijah walked among them, present but not intrusive, watching the group find its shape. He checked in with the clinical counselor daily. He sat in on the first soil science session and the first livestock management clinic. He spent one afternoon working alongside a group of 4 participants who were rebuilding a section of the creek bank that a week of rain had partially undone, and he worked with them for 4 hours, saying little and doing a great deal, which is a particular form of teaching that does not get enough credit. Thomas Walker came that first Saturday. He came in jeans and a dark green flannel shirt, as Elijah had asked, and he brought 2 of his deputies, Crane among them, both also in civilian clothes. They introduced themselves simply, first names only, and they were assigned to work groups the same way every volunteer was assigned, which is to say, without deference to their profession or their history with this particular place. Crane ended up in the Creek Bank group. Thomas ended up working with a team that was clearing an invasive thistle stand from the eastern slope of the property, a job that required sustained physical effort and careful attention to root systems. Working beside him in that group was a 28-year-old Marine Corps veteran named Deshaun Carter from Memphis, Tennessee, who had served 2 deployments in the Middle East and come home with a deep interest in environmental science that the Marine Corps had developed, but civilian employment had not known how to channel. Deshaun was, by the end of his first week in the program, already passionate about what he was learning and constitutionally incapable of not sharing it. So he talked while they worked, explaining to Thomas with considerable expertise and genuine enthusiasm why the thistle was such a persistent problem, the depth of its root system, the way it produced allelopathic chemicals that suppressed competing vegetation, the long-term effect on soil structure and the downstream impact on the watershed if the invasion was left unaddressed. Thomas pulled at a root system for a while, listening. Then he said, "How long have you known this stuff?" "About a week," Deshaun said, without a trace of irony. Thomas laughed. It was the first time he had laughed in several days, and the sound surprised him. "Where did you learn it?" "The instructor here is incredible. Dr. Simmons. She knows every plant on this property by its Latin name and by what it does to everything around it. She makes you feel like the whole landscape is a conversation that's been going on for 1,000 years, and you just got here and caught the middle of it." Thomas nodded slowly. He was thinking about what Elijah had said weeks ago, about veterans knowing how to learn things, about the military training that capacity and the program giving it something worth absorbing. Looking at Deshaun, at the energy and precision with which he described what he'd learned in 7 days, Thomas could see it clearly. It was not abstract anymore. At lunch, Thomas found Elijah standing at the edge of the pasture, looking north toward the mountains. He stood beside him, and they were quiet together for a few minutes in the way that 2 people can be quiet when the relationship between them has been forged, however painfully, into something genuine. "He knows more about riparian ecology than I do," Thomas said, meaning Deshaun. "After a week, he knew how to learn it," Elijah said. "That's what the military does, whatever else you want to say about it. It teaches people how to absorb information under pressure and apply it without a lot of time to think. We just gave him something worth absorbing." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, "I've been thinking about what you said, about distance between communities and institutions, and I think you were right. I think I drove the same roads in this county for 11 years and told myself I knew what was on them. And yesterday morning, working out here, listening to that young man explain what thistle does to a watershed, I understood something I should have understood a long time ago. You don't know a community because you drive through it. You know it because you've worked alongside the people in it, done something real with them, been accountable to the same outcome as them." He paused. "I've been doing one of those things and thinking it counted for both." Elijah looked at him. "That's a hard thing to say. It's an important thing to say." "Yes, it is." They stood a while longer, looking at the mountains. Below them in the pasture, 22 veterans and 3 law enforcement officers were eating lunch together in the April sunlight, some of them already planning the afternoon's work, some of them telling stories about service and about home and about the particular strangeness of the period between those 2 things, some of them simply sitting in the rare and specific peace of a person who has found, at least for this day, exactly where they are supposed to be. Deshaun Carter was holding court at the far end of the lunch area, apparently explaining something about soil pH to 3 people who were listening with full attention, which is the most gratifying sight available to any teacher anywhere in the world. Elijah watched them and felt the thing he had been building toward for years, not pride exactly, which is a small and often self-referential emotion, but something larger and more outward-facing. Satisfaction, maybe, in its deepest form. The satisfaction of a man who had decided, very deliberately, that one morning's injustice would not define him, would not diminish him, would not redirect the energy he had committed to something real and lasting. He had taken that cold morning, and those handcuffs, and that hard plastic seat in the back of a county cruiser, and he had processed it the way he had processed everything the Army and the world had put in his path, with full attention, without flinching, and without losing what he knew to be true about himself or about the fundamental decency of people when you give them the conditions to be decent. The program's first cohort would complete their 12-week rotation in July. 17 of the 22 would go on to employment in agriculture, conservation land management, or rural business operations within 6 months of completing the program. 3 would stay on as staff at Cornerstone, Montana. 2 would use the skills and confidence they developed at the ranch to launch operations of their own on family land back in their home states, 1 in Tennessee, 1 in rural Georgia, both of them reaching back into Elijah's network for guidance and resources as they built. The Cornerstone, Montana Veteran Agricultural Center would be cited that fall in a federal interagency report on best practices in veteran reintegration, a report that was distributed to 41 states and read by people in positions to fund things. Within 18 months, Elijah was in active conversation with officials in Idaho, Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico about replicating the model on other historic properties in those states, and a second Cornerstone Center was in the planning stages on a former timber property in northern Idaho. Thomas Walker's department revised its property dispute response protocols 3 weeks after the incident, establishing the county recorder's database check as a mandatory first step before any action at a property dispute scene. The new protocol was adopted quietly, without press, without ceremony, which was how Thomas wanted it, not as a public relations gesture, but as an actual operational change that would prevent the same mistake from happening again. He did not speak publicly about what had happened at the Harlan Ranch that October morning, because he did not believe that public statements about private failures were the right currency. What he believed in was changed behavior, and the behavior changed. Deputy Crane requested and received a transfer to the Community Relations Division of the department, where he turned out to be remarkably good at exactly the kind of human contact that October morning had shown him he was not yet prepared for. Roy Garland came to the ranch in June. He came on his own, which cost him more than he would have admitted, and he asked to speak with Elijah. Elijah received him in the open pasture, which was where he received everyone, because he believed that a pasture was the most honest setting available for a conversation. No walls, no desk between people, just the land and the light, and whatever truth the two of them could manage. Roy did not make a speech either. He said what he had done, named it plainly, said he was sorry for it, and asked if there was anything he could do. Elijah shook his hand and told him that the best thing Roy could do was to let this place be what it was going to be, to let the veterans come and go and become part of the fabric of the valley, and to introduce himself to the next cohort the same way he would introduce himself to any neighbor. Roy said he would, and Elijah believed him, because he had learned, over a long life, to extend the belief that people could grow until they showed him definitively that they could not. Roy had not shown him that. None of what the future held was visible from where Elijah stood that April afternoon at the edge of the pasture. What was visible was the creek, and the mountains, and the people eating lunch in the grass, and the fence line running straight to the horizon, and the east barn with its restored roof catching the afternoon light, and the young man from Memphis explaining something about the earth to anyone who would listen. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in fact, everything that a man who had served his country for 31 years, who had come home and built something from discipline and belief, and the stubborn conviction that things could be better than they were, could possibly have hoped to see on a warm spring afternoon in Montana. He turned from the view and walked back toward the group, because there was still work to do, and the afternoon was young, and the creek bank was not going to restore itself. He walked across the pasture at the pace of a man who knows where he is going, and is not in a hurry about it, which is the pace of someone who trusts the work and trusts the land and trusts the people beside him to show up tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that. That was the ranch. That was the program. That was the man. And the mountains, as always, said nothing, only stood there, patient and enormous, watching it all become exactly what it needed to be. One day's honest work at a time.